Thank you very much. Oh, gosh, this is much longer. Screen, so. Good. Okay. I don't know. Has anyone read this book? Good. Otherwise,
No.
why would you be here? Precisely. So that's fine. Let's just sort of go on. Let's just try to find something to move on. Right. So I want to first show. Now, this is in the book, but it's absolutely central thought about it. And, you know, as you know, Donald Rumsfeld was a senior member of the American government. And he made this one talk once. You may have seen it yourself in the past, but it's good to play, and I'll explain what I mean by it.
There are reports that there is no evidence of a direct link between Baghdad and some of these terrorist organizations.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
Excuse me, but is this an unknown unknown?
I'm not.
Several unknowns, and I'm just wondering if this is an unknown.
I'm not going to say which it is.
But the Secretary,
You know, I'm right here. I'm right here.
Okay. So in many ways, you know, he got himself a bit confused, but there's a good thought behind it. Now, imagine this circle containing all knowledge that exists in the world, even more than what's on Google. How much of it would you know? Well, the reality is, it will be a speck. It will be a tiny, small amount. And that's what we'd say is what we know, right? Now, therefore, that must imply that there's a lot of stuff that we know we don't know. So I do not know anything about sort of the Russian language, for example. I know very little about astrophysics, etc. So we have a large chunk, but actually, that is not everything. So that green space is what we know we don't know, right? And then there is then the space of what we don't know we don't know. You know, and the reality is, as probably many of you done, you know, when you've gone and done your masters or you've done some, you know, you started to develop an sort of interest and depth of experience. You realize how little you know. The more you know you don't know, if you know what I mean. So, you know, and one of the problems is that gets in the way of us moving on, because, you know, there's a great phrase like we see what we believe rather than we believe what we see. And what we know we do is, by and large, we have a paradigm of information. And what we seem to do is we try to like sort of, you know, make sense of new information. And if it fits the model, that's fine. We take it on board, it builds our knowledge. If somehow it sort of contradicts or somehow challenges where we are, then we tend to either like delete it. So we'll do a Trump, climate is not an issue. We'll distort the information, you know, or else we'll generalize. Okay, well, that's an outlier piece of information, but generally, you know, it's all like that. And therefore, we have a very blinkered view about stuff. And this is really like what is the core issue in this book, you know, which, you know, in sort of summary, it's just about we need to be able to have greater humbleness and humility about what we know, you know, to be sort of intellectually sort of agile and be able to let go of stuff to allow new stuff to come in. You know, so we need to develop this mental agility, particularly in this rapidly evolving and changing workspace and living space where new information is coming in all the time, and therefore we need to be able to have the opportunity to rethink. Otherwise, we get locked in. We'll talk later on about mental fossils. And we therefore need to develop. Now, one of the things they talk about in this book is this idea about taking on, you know, rather than this, you know, we talk a preacher, a politician, and we'll come to a bit later on, this idea of being scientists. What a scientist holds truth very lightly. Because a scientist is always being prepared to sort of move on his or her thinking and say, this is a hypothesis I hold, let's test it, let's get some empiricism to it, and then we can then sort of further develop it. And if it doesn't hold hold any validity, it gets thrown away and a new hypothesis gets put in place. So therefore, we need to have this intellectual humility to say we don't know it all, because the trouble is, and it therefore challenges our identity. We need to be able to, in the space to say, you know what, I don't know it all, versus what we tend to do, and particularly the more we get senior in a role, we tend to take on those sort of, we are the expert here, and we therefore hold tight onto our information, seeing it as a sort of, as a place where our identity and our value lives, versus being able to say, look, I know jack shit and nothing. See my use of language. And therefore we need to be able to hold onto that thing you probably all got, when you're at university, this idea of critical thinking. The book also goes on about, it's not just about us, but how do other people change? How do we get them? Because very often we're working with other people, and it talks a lot about how to influence. And this idea, the key to persuasion is not about talking, it's about listening and validating where they are. And only when at that point can you then have the opportunity to slightly nudge them in what they're thinking about. And a lot of the stuff they talk about is about change away from binary, this sort of black and whiteness. It's like, that's good, therefore that must be bad. And say, no, whilst we naturally want to simplify, we all are simplifying stuff. I'm trying to simplify this book right now, is actually there's a complexity, and complexity starts to demonstrate that these aren't hard edges, they're very soft edges, and all of this thinking sort of overlaps. And if you can start to sort of soften those edges, you start to have the opportunity that they can see that not everything is that way, can do that way. So therefore that's what that's about. So let's go into some detail about the book. So therefore there are three key themes they run through the book: is how to shift your thinking, how to shift other thinking, and how to shift collective thinking. So that's like you, individual, other person, one person, group, culture, organization. Here's the last one. They started quite, you may have heard this about this guy called Wagner Dodge, and basically what happened is all these forest fires, I think it was in California, they basically was sort of like, parachute people in, they go and try and control the fire. This particular time, the fire got out of control. And what Wayne Dodge did, he did something that he'd never been trained to go and do. He basically lit a patch around him and burnt off any of the fuel, and basically he then lay in that place very close to the ground. And basically he survived as the fire raged over the top of him and took out another 12 other of his people. And there was a very tragic example about how new thinking, not based on any past precedent, is how that made him survive, and created a lot of work into exploring that thing. And I think the truth is that we need to have new thoughts in these new times, because old thoughts in new times just don't work for us. We live in this VUCA world, and talking about there's 5 times more information is being bombarded to us than actually 25 years ago. And I think that sounds quite, a conservative number, I would have thought. We are lazy thinkers in this view that, we hold on to something, we seize and freeze was the word they use in the book. This idea that, we hold on to something, okay, I've got that concept right, now let's lock it in place. And I don't want to have it challenged, I just want to stay with it. I'd rather have certainty than be right. And we see that all the time with factions and things like this. And therefore, once you've locked it that way, as we all know, in all forms of change, not just behavior change, but cognitive change, I resist it. So it's got to be a major paradigm shift. It's got to be totally broken before most people will let go of quite old concepts. He talks a lot in the book about being locked to be prisoners of our own thoughts. Actually, some great writing. It's really had some great sort of one-liners in this book, which I really liked it. He talks about this concept, about being stranded on Mount Stupid. And that, you know, and there's this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And basically what it is actually we are supremely confident when we have little information. It's you know, I can be very rude, I don't mean to be rude, but it's the sort of radical kind of. The reason I think that she won the American Open was because she was so young and so naive and knew no fear. Therefore, she was supremely confident. You know, in about 20 years' time, you know, when she gets to becoming, you know, a little bit like sort of what Venus Williams is, who's struggling now to make the next leap, is she's so full of that sort of negative thinking about what has and what could happen. So what we know is that what happens is when you have little experience, you are extremely confident. You are naively confident. And then as you get more experience, so your confidence dips. And only when you get to the other side. I'm really talking about this idea about, you know, people are more confident when they're less competent. And the more we know something, the more we have a humility about it, you know. So it's like being aware of, like, are your mouth stupid here? And as I said earlier on, you know, there's this concept about you've got to be a scientist. You've got to hold your opinions and your beliefs quite lightly, set up hypotheses, test them with empiricism. And talks about, I think, a very interesting thought about, you know, beliefs are often faith-based rather than fact-based. You know, I'm not trying to challenge anyone's religion, but you can't upset someone's faith with facts. You know, it doesn't work because you're just working on a completely different level. And very often, you know, people's belief systems are imprinted in them by their culture, by their mum, by their dad, by their work, by their school, by their religion, by whatever, you know. And we just hold on to those. And we find it very difficult to challenge those. And some work done by, and I can never pronounce his name, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, it goes on, a wonderful long name. But basically, he said that when he was looking at all this work done by top science, is they embrace being wrong, because what scientists have is this idea about, you know, wow, I'm wrong, therefore it's an opportunity to learn and grow and, you know, do this stuff. And therefore, this idea about the joy of being wrong, rather than the embarrassment about being wrong, is really an important space to be. And therefore, this idea about intellectual humility and basic cognitive flexibility, you know, that didn't work. I'm happy to go over there. That's what it's about. And this idea about learn every day, and I sort of, you know, often, you know, if I'm running one in my workshops, I would say, you know, to the day you take your very last breath is an opportunity to keep on learning. And so many people just stop learning. They stop learning when they're 30, when they're 40, when they're 50, when they're 60, and it's just like a criminal shame that they're not embracing the knowledge and growing all the time. And I love this phrase from Jeff Bezos: if you don't change your mind frequently, you're going to be wrong a lot. You know, this idea. He talks a lot about, you know, what we notice is that with people who are doing certain things, they're constantly changing. They're adapting. They're changing information all the time to get to a better space, rather than, so they're iterating their way, you know, towards, you know, getting closer to truth. Not we ever actually find totality of truth, but you got to inch your way there. You've got to be prepared to, like, change, shape, and hone your way to get there. And therefore, there's a whole principle about letting go of the past, about, you know, your knowledge base, your values, your beliefs have got to be based on the nowness rather than the past. And too many of us are the past me rather than the current me. So this idea about being able to not be, you know, the boy you were and be the man you are now, or the woman you are now. You know, this idea about moving on, and this whole idea about identity. Who am I? And if our identity is locked into things like, you know, all these values and principles and, you know, belief systems, it basically locks you down. And what they're sort of saying is actually you should be actually saying, like, I value, and change those to, like, I value, information, I value knowledge, I value learning. That becomes a constantly flexible, space, rather than say, I believe in this, because beliefs change. Once upon a time, ladies and gentlemen, you believe Father Christmas existed. Sorry to shatter your illusions now, but if we look at ourselves as beliefs may have to change and adapt. And obviously, we've all seen this before, particularly on social media, about how people live in sort of the bubbles. We all sort of bounce with people who share the same values as us. So our support groups, our friendship groups, the websites we visit very much keeps us locked into a space. And actually, that therefore reinforces us, because that holds us in, oh, well, therefore it must be true because Jack thinks so and that website thinks so. Versus we're saying, no, you've got to actually invite yourself to be challenged. You've got to develop challenge networks. You've got to look at this other stuff. And we know this all the time from creativity, that creativity basically grows out of diversity. And if you're just talking to the same people all the time, there's no diversity. So we've got to have that, and we've got to be open to challenge and to hear other people's points of view. And so this is where diversity comes in, and diversity in totality, not just diversity in just sort of in ethnicity or sexuality. It's this idea that, as you've probably heard this, three blind men stumble across an elephant, and each sees a different truth, because there's that multiplicity of truth that goes on. And basically, what we've got to do is sort of celebrate, the multiplicity of perspective, and encourage it and allow it to be possible. So there was a great story in the book about Toy Story, about how, after the success of Toy Story, Pixar wanted to do another blockbuster, and they recruited this director called Brad Bird to make the next one. And of course, he wanted to do something very different, and basically said, well, we don't have the money, we don't have what you're trying to do is too complicated. And said, stuff that. And he basically went through the organisation. He got the Mavericks together, the people who challenged. He said, right, you know what, we're going to prove this organisation wrong. And out of that, they developed The Incredibles, that grossed $631 million and won an Oscar, because they challenged the system. They said, we'll find different ways to do it. Fine, we won't do it like that, we'll do it like that. So actually, there's a whole lot about people who see things differently, was about, because you really think, right? So the way to make a film is like that. And they talk about the power of constructive conflict. Lots of work has been done in this, in that side of this book. This idea, they talk about sort of the two Wright brothers, about how, because they were brothers, but basically they fought like cat and dogs, but there was respect with each other and they challenged each other. And out of that, they basically were the first to get into manpower flight. And this idea about we've got to allow debate to happen, because without debate, without challenging our thinking, we just get into a much weaker place. And it's the challenge which is so critical. And if we can learn to challenge the idea and not the ego, then we are going to be in a very powerful place. And that, therefore, they've triggered into all the psychological safety that, we probably read about, and that's a very important place. That how do we allow people to say things without closing them down? And a great phrase in the book, the absence of conflict isn't harmony, it's apathy. Because if you can't challenge everything I give up, you just do what you want to, and that is therefore the death of actually a great thinking. So part 2 is helping others to rethink, and in this one, they talk about the 3 mindsets we often adopt in conversation. This was Philip Tetlock. He's done some other work, in the past about, experts. But he said, we can often be the preacher. We're trying to protect our ideas. We're trying to say, hey, this is what's so good about this stuff, because if you're attacked, no, this is why it's right. Or we're the prosecutor. We're basically attacking others. This is why you're wrong. Or we take the politician where we try to win them over to our side. Hey, look, come to our side rather than the other side. And it's sort of saying that, those three actually force you to take a certain position, and that doesn't really help in actually getting through to people. It makes the point, look, people don't necessarily change. When you challenge them, you're more likely to lock them into their place. So when you ask, why is a very bad question, because why forces you to have to defend your position. And when you make someone defend their position, you lock them in that position, because you are challenging, you are making them say, if you can't defend your position, then you're wrong. And no one likes to be told they're wrong. So you've got to be very careful about this. So it says, ask the question, how, if you are a believer of X, he said, well, how are you going to make that happen? And then they start to stumble over the howness. And that starts to make them. So what you've got to do is not directly challenge head on their position, but almost like come through it through the side door. So in other words, ask them, really interested, about how you actually formed that opinion. And that was, very much this idea that people are often given their ideas, or they're not really properly thought through. So if you can somehow just destabilize a fraction, you don't need to knock it completely over, just like get it to tilt a bit, you're more likely to make them want to change their minds. So they're saying that rational debate just doesn't win over the argument. It doesn't win because you do that. Here are the 20 reasons why you should do this. And here are the 20 reasons why you're wrong. What that does, it automatically puts up the barriers, and they will defend to the final hilt, to their final breath, why they are not wrong. People do not like being told they are wrong. The only person who can define their wrongness, apart from a judge, is actually if they can find it in themselves. They are much more open to that if you have tilted the axis. And also they say, which I often said before, if you give people 20 reasons, they'll focus on the one which is the weakest, pathetic reason you've got to put, and they'll bring down your deck of cards. And they say, don't dilute stick to the three most powerful, irrefutable truth about your stuff. That is more likely to be evidential than to trail a long tail of increasingly weaker arguments on your side. So just don't go that way. And he said, we got to get away from the emotion of this stuff. So don't get into fights. Dance. Don't fight. Discuss. Don't debate. So a debate suggests a sidedness. Like at the Oxford Union Debating Society. The motion before the House is this or that, and therefore it becomes very binary. And we say dance with them, work together, get interested, discuss it, be curious is how you're more likely to change people's minds. Now, for those who may know, I'm training to become a psychotherapist, and one of the great moves in the psychotherapy was a guy called Carl Rogers, and basically he talked about the core conditions. And whilst this book doesn't talk about it, it basically hints at that stuff. So I just bring my own stuff in. And the three core conditions of a psychotherapeutic relationship is empathy. It's about congruence, about you being in that space, you being authentic, and about unconditional positive regard, not being judgmental. So in other words, if you really want to help influence someone, you've got to come to that space in the same place. You've really got to try to understand where they are and why they are there, and why is important for them. And I'll keep using the word why, but he said not to use why. But so there's a place of genuine curiosity and a sense of being open to listen and non-judgmental. Acknowledgement is the most important place to be, because only when you get to a place of acknowledgement, Stephen Covey talks about, first seek to understand, before being understood. And we've got to basically validate where they are is really important rather than putting them down. And therefore the power of questions, which you all as researchers are naturally gifted at doing this. And about find the common ground, not what's wrong, but where are you both together? That's where the area you've got to work on. So do we both agree that actually this is the area we're both trying to get to? Find the common yeses, then you build bridges. Otherwise, you're just breaking bridges all the time. And they talk about the vaccine whisperer, which I thought was quite relevant, bearing in mind all the COVID issues. And I use a very NLP-ish phrase for those who know about neuro-linguistic programming, which is a phrase they use called pace, lead. And this idea that you work with them, you get to understand it, so you listen to understand their world and their choices. And then maybe you will say, it's difficult, isn't it? There are these fractions, there are these difficulties, there are these contradictions. So at this point, all you're doing is just raising a fraction of doubt. That's all you need. You need to create a bit of doubt. And then during this process of what they're talking about, so imagine you are talking to someone who's actually anti-COVID. You say, it's confusing because there's some people saying this, some people saying that. What's the right thing to go and do? And what's not the right thing? So I really respect, why you would be confused and unsure about going and having the vaccine. And having listened to them, you then ask permission to share some information that you may have. And when they say, I'm happy to hear your side, now you've expressed, they feel fully heard and understood, they will then be prepared to listen to you a bit. And when they do that, they are demonstrating a place of openness to listen. Beforehand, when you say, let me put my side, they're not going to listen to you. It'll go one ear straight out the other. So this is like you, and you just present it in a non-judgmental, a non-lecturing, a non-partisan way. So here's some other information. The softness is all important. The tonality is all important. And at the end, they say, you reaffirm that, look, that's the information. But you're the one to choose. You must do what you think is right for your family. And then you leave it like that. And they talk about this principle of sustained talk. Listen to what keeps them where they are. And listen for their errors of doubt. And obviously, when there's a slight crack, as often we do, we go down that rabbit hole. We find it. We say, tell me some more about that. Why are you unsure? And then you open up the crack a little bit wider. So it's a very subtler way of influencing. And they talk about this thing about complexifying. You got to break up the binary, because very often, people will oversimplify complex situations. They say it's that or it's that. And actually what you've got to do is demonstrate the shades of gray and almost deliberately create greater complexity, greater confusion to demonstrate it is much more complicated, much more difficult than we first lay out. It isn't as like, Brexit wasn't all about this and that, and actually that was what, you could say that, what the Brexit Party did very successfully is they basically simplified it down to two different things. But actually the reality is the argument was much more complicated than that. So now move on to part three, and part three is really about rethinking collective. So, communities, organizations, etc. This sort of really fit completely into this, because it is this idea about, being, a critical thinker. And here's some principles for critical thinking. These aren't in the book, but just they talk about you got to adopt critical thinking. I take this phrase from someone who once said to me, just don't swallow things whole. Chew it over, spit out the bits that don't work, and swallow the bits that work. In the book, it talks about, a lot of work done in schools, this idea about, what you want people to do is to sort of build ideas up. And this lovely phrase you mentioned, but I need time for my confusion. when ideas are quite complex, what you got to do is you allow time for them to start to sort of to actually marinate, to actually be able to sort of form their view. So they suggest this process about think, pair, share, and I thought it was quite nice. So therefore, you said, have some time for self-reflection, then get into pairs, share those ideas together. You get a bit of sort of understanding how people see things differently, and then you share it in the bigger space and the big space and the big space. So therefore, we get a more rounded answer rather than just literally going for the first simple straight answer, because that will very often be wrong, and time is critical to allow yourself to be able to almost like digest it, to allow you to move on. I always say that the more you know a subject, the more distinctions you can get to understand about it. But at the very start of your coffee experience, you can only just do, well, it's coffee or it's tea. Then you can do it's black or it's white. And then you can do it's cappuccino or it's latte. And then you can do add soy, da 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 da. So we've got to like move ourselves through to a greater place of complexity. And therefore they talk this idea about, you've got, this thinking process is very active. It's very sort of experiential. This idea that we learn through thinking, we learn more through doing, and our beliefs are more influenced by the experience of something. You can tell some of the cows come home about why they should drive at a slower speed, but it's when they've actually had a car accident do they suddenly wake up to why it's important to drive at 20 miles an hour in past school. There's this iterative process. We don't get it right first time. You've got to keep going back. You've got to keep and this co-created this challenge and this reflect. And it's like that's the way that knowledge really builds. We need to have. And then he talks about this idea. We live in a society, particularly in organisations, where we're all trying to do best practice. So we're trying to codify practice. What works really well? Let's grab it, and then we lock it in. And the trouble is, what we're saying is, when you lock things in, it basically was well, because what was great 20 years ago about how you make this is not great now, because of this massively emerging, dynamic space that we're living in. And one thing he talks about is that in organizations, there's so much sort of focus upon the outcome delivery, where the KPIs are set like that, the bonus systems are set like that. That's what everyone's focused on. Then basically what it is, it basically sort of locks people into old patterns and processes because they can't afford to get it wrong, because the stakes are far too high. When the stakes come really high, you don't do anything new. You don't take a risk. I'd rather do it that way with a guaranteed chance of getting 80% right than chucking it to the wind to aim for 100% because I may get 1%. So therefore, they're saying, no, what we've actually got to do is change where the focus is, change where the KPIs are, where the bonus is given on process. Because then what then is it then allows the unlocking of process to develop a better process, and out of a better process comes a greater, richer outcome. So in summary, think like a scientist, hold on to your ideas lightly and test hypotheses with evidence and be able to let go of stuff. And therefore be able to have a humility and a joy in getting it wrong, rather than right now it's an embarrassment and shame of getting it wrong. Beware of getting stranded on Mount Stupid. The less you know, the more competent you are. The more you know, the more you realize that, we have to be have a humbleness in our knowledge. Harness the benefits of doubt, be humble, embrace the joy of being wrong. Build a challenger network, not just a support network. So invite challenge in, allow that to grow within your organizations. And therefore don't shy away from constructive conflict. Frame disagreements as debates, not as arguments. Allow there to, debate the topic, not the person. Practice the art of persuasive listening. You're going to convince them more by listening to them than by telling them. Ask how rather than why, and acknowledge common ground. Find the bits that we agree on rather than always being focused on what we don't agree on. Less is more. Don't dilute the power of your argument with weaker points. Just stick to the 3 irrefutable facts. Keep repeating them. Reinforce freedom of choice. It's your choice. Be very subtle and light in how you impose your views upon other people. Do it like you said, but look, at the end of the day, it's your choice. It's your life. It's your decision. You do that. Then people don't feel foisted on. No one wants to be told stuff. You've got to invite them, put the information in front of them, and then let them pick up the information themselves. Complexify contentious issues. Move away from that binary view of what's right and what's wrong. And therefore, don't shy away from the caveats and contingencies. I remember, one person telling me that the best way of selling creative work is not to suggest it's the best thing that's ever happened, because it's a lie. Every time you come and say, "Oh my God, we're so excited about this work, it's perfect," and every time I say, "I don't trust you when you say that." So actually, we said, "Look, we think we've got this up. There's still some more work to be done. And there are some edges that aren't quite right, but at least you're being truthful about that stuff. And if you are able to be, have that degree of, we're close towards an answer, but no answer is perfect. You're more likely to get a buy-in to it than if you try to oversell something. And you may therefore allow them to be said, well, yeah, I recognize that our answer isn't perfect either. So you find that good. And there's abandon best practices, because the best practice of last week is not the best practice of this week. And establish psychological safety. So therefore, you do invite people in to come and talk. So there we are. That's a quick whistle-stop tour around it. So really open up now for anyone who's got any questions, or you want to have any debate about this stuff.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. That's wonderful. If you stop screen sharing, maybe we can all see each other, which would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I love that. It was great. So yes, I'll stop the recording if everybody would rather, and then we can question away. So I'll stop.